The night the telegram arrived, the Seine lay like black glass beneath the bridges, carrying only the whisper of rain and the hum of a distant barge. At Quai des Orfèvres, Inspector Moreau sat alone, the glow of a kerosene lamp trembling on the rim of his glass. The message was brief, 6 words, unsigned, and delivered from a provincial post. She knows his name. Stop him. No address, no context, only a chill certainty that somewhere in the sleeping body of France a murder had already chosen its hour. Moreau's eyes lingered on the ink, the letters slightly smeared by rain, and he felt the strange weight of inevitability. Whoever had written this had not asked for help, they had foretold a crime. If you find yourself drawn into stories that unravel slowly, like cigarette smoke above a dying ember, follow us here. Subscribe, share this with those who love mysteries born from silence and doubt, and stay close. In the fog of Paris, one whispered name can change everything. The storm had broken over Paris hours ago, but the night refused to dry. The streets still glistened like black ribbons under the gaslight, and every corner exhaled that damp, metallic scent of rain-soaked stone. At Quai des Orfèvres, the building slept. The corridors echoed faintly with the ticking of unseen clocks, and in Inspector Moreau's office, a single kerosene lamp trembled at the edge of its wick, its glow bending through the rising curl of pipe smoke. Moreau sat without his jacket, his sleeves rolled, the kind of posture born from habit rather than comfort. The ashtray beside him was a small graveyard of thought. Then came the knock, tentative, irregular, as though whoever stood beyond the door feared the weight of what they carried. He rose, opened it, and found a telegraph boy standing in the corridor, his cap pulled too low, his boots wet. The boy offered the envelope wordlessly, his eyes darting past Moreau's shoulder to the interior of the room, where files and maps sprawled like the entrails of unfinished crimes. Moreau slipped him a coin, but the boy hesitated before taking it. "They told me to give it to you in person," he murmured. Then, almost to himself, "and to say it was urgent." He turned and vanished down the hall before Moreau could reply. The envelope was soft from the rain, the glue at the flap barely holding. Moreau tore it open with a matchstick and unfolded the paper. 6 words, unevenly spaced, written by hand rather than machine. She knows his name. Stop him. No signature. No address. The time stamp, 2347. Origin, Saint-Lazare. For a moment he simply stared at the message. The words pulsed faintly under the lamp, the ink slightly bled where a drop of water had touched it. There was no formality, no police code, no structure. Yet something in their urgency struck deeper than protocol ever could. He turned the telegram over, but there was nothing more. A clean back, ghosted slightly by the imprint of the message. He stood by the window, pipe in hand, looking out over the river. Below, the Seine flowed dark and patient beneath Pont Saint-Michel, catching the occasional shimmer of carriage lamps. The city was half asleep, its heart still beating behind shuttered windows. Somewhere, a woman laughed, a thin, solitary sound carried up through the damp air. Moreau took a long drag from his pipe and exhaled. He'd spent 20 years among lies that tried to sound like truth, and truths too fragile to be believed. But this was something different. He sat again and reached for the map pinned to the wall, its surface punctured with coloured pins marking crimes old and new. His fingers traced the railway lines that stretched north toward the provinces, toward the station from which the telegram had come. Saint-Lazare, a labyrinth of platforms, porters, and anonymity. Thousands passed through each day, travellers, lovers, fugitives. He could picture it now, the telegraph clerk half asleep, the sender shrouded in urgency, a name never written. There was a knock again, softer this time. It was Janvier, his most reliable man, young but already carrying the fatigue of the trade in his eyes. "Still here, Inspector?" Janvier asked, stepping into the light. "It's past midnight." Moreau handed him the telegram. Janvier read it twice, frowning. No sender. None, but Saint-Lazare. That's a start. Janvier rubbed his chin. Could be a prank, or a drunk. Perhaps. Moreau leaned back, studying him. But if it isn't, someone out there believes a murder hasn't yet happened, and that we might stop it. They exchanged a long look, the kind that carried more than words. Then Moreau reached for his coat. "Wake the driver, we're going." The rain resumed just as they stepped into the courtyard. It fell in fine, cold lines that blurred the gaslight into halos. The carriage horse snorted, its breath white in the darkness. As they crossed the Pont Neuf, the wind rose from the river, tugging at Moreau's hat, carrying the distant clang of bells from Notre Dame. He thought of those 6 words again, their simplicity, their certainty. Somewhere, a woman, or someone claiming to be one, believed she knew a killer's name before he had killed. By the time they reached Saint-Lazare, the city had folded itself into silence. Only the lamps burned, long yellow corridors of light stretching across the damp platforms. A watchman nodded at their badges and led them toward the telegraph office. Inside, the clerk, an old man with ink-stained cuffs, squinted as they entered. "You sent this," Moreau said, placing the telegram on the counter. The clerk adjusted his spectacles, frowned. "Yes, I remember. Came in just before closing. A woman, I think. She was trembling." "Describe her?" He hesitated. "Not young, not old. Wore a coat too thin for the weather." She spoke softly as if afraid someone might hear. "I asked if she wanted to sign, and she said no, paid in coins, small ones. Then she left before I could count them." Moreau's gaze drifted to the ledger. "May I?" The man nodded. The entry was there, the final telegram of the night. No name, only the destination. "To Inspector Moreau, Quai des Orfèvres." "She knew where to find you?" Janvier murmured. Moreau didn't answer. He was staring at a small blot of ink beside the entry, shaped almost like a teardrop. The clerk noticed his gaze. "She spilled a bit of ink," he said. Her hands were shaking. Outside, the rain thickened. Moreau walked the length of the platform, his shoes splashing through shallow puddles. A train stood waiting for the morning run north, its windows empty, its engine sighing steam like a weary beast. He imagined her, the woman, walking away down these tracks, vanishing into a country darkness where no one would ask her name. He paused beneath the iron canopy and lit another match for his pipe. The flame fluttered, then steadied. "She knows his name," he whispered, repeating the telegram's first line as though testing it against the night. It was neither accusation nor plea, more like a confession spoken to no one. Janvier joined him, collar up, rain dripping from his hat. "If she's telling the truth," he said, "then she's in danger." "If she's lying," Moreau replied, "someone else is." The clock above them struck 1. The sound echoed across the empty station like the toll of something larger than time. Moreau drew in a long breath, felt the cold in his lungs. Somewhere between Paris and the provinces, a story had begun, one that refused to wait for dawn. When they finally returned to the carriage, the city's lamps were dimming, and a mist was rising from the river. Moreau leaned back against the seat, his eyelids heavy but his mind unwilling to rest. The telegram lay in his pocket, damp against his chest. He thought again of those 6 words, how perfectly incomplete they were, how they left every possibility open, including the one that he was already too late. He watched the reflection of passing lamps slide across the window, like ghosts. The horse's hooves clopped rhythmically against the cobblestones, and somewhere in that rhythm he thought he could hear another sound beneath it. A woman's voice, faint, almost pleading, repeating the same name over and over. But when he tried to catch it, the voice dissolved into the hiss of rain. By the time they reached the prefecture, dawn was little more than a promise behind the clouds. Moreau stepped down, his coat heavy with water. Janvier paused at the gate. What will you do? Find her, Moreau said simply. Before he does. He turned and disappeared into the grey corridors of the building, the telegram still folded in his hand, its ink beginning to blur, as if the words themselves were already fading into the mystery they had summoned. The town of Saint-Lazare was not large enough to hide guilt, but just large enough to pretend it didn't exist. When Inspector Moreau arrived the next evening, the rain had not yet forgiven the streets. The square was a hollow echo of footsteps and shutters, its fountain dry, its clock tower marking an hour that no one seemed to honour any more. The train from Paris had wheezed to a stop and left as if ashamed of having come. Moreau, stepping from the carriage, felt the air shift. That invisible density he'd learned to recognise over years of investigations, a silence too careful to be natural. He followed the cobbled road past the post office and the mairie, each window a grey eye watching him pass. The telegram had originated here, but the sender's trail was faint, more rumour than evidence. Janvier had returned to Paris with reports to file and strings to pull. Moreau preferred to walk alone. He had a sense that this case would require silence, not bureaucracy. The boarding house stood at the end of Rue des Acacias, 3 floors of faded green shutters and peeling paint, its sign half lit by a flickering gas lamp. Inside, the air smelled of starch and damp linen. The landlady, a thin woman with red-rimmed eyes, looked up from her accounts and studied him like a suspicious parishioner. "I'm looking for a girl," he said, showing his badge but not his fatigue. "She sent a telegram last night. To me. From the station." The woman frowned. "A telegram? From here? She might have been staying with you. Describe her." Moreau paused. "Young, perhaps. Worn coat. Alone." The woman hesitated. Her hands twitched toward the register but stopped halfway. "Room 4, she said finally. "She came 2 nights ago. Didn't give her name. Paid in advance. Barely speaks. Keeps the shutters closed all day." Moreau nodded, slipped her a few francs and climbed the narrow staircase. The wood creaked under his boots. The walls, once painted cream, had yellowed into something closer to tobacco. Outside room 4 he heard nothing. He knocked once. No answer. Then more softly, "Mademoiselle? Inspector Moreau, Paris Prefecture." A pause, the sound of movement. Then the latch turned. The door opened just enough for her face to appear. Pale, framed by dark hair that looked hastily brushed, her eyes wide but not frightened. "Yes," she said quietly. "I thought you would come." Moreau removed his hat. The air in the room was still, faintly perfumed by candle smoke and damp paper. The single window was half covered by a curtain, and beside it stood a small writing desk littered with torn telegram sheets, a bottle of ink, and a candle burned almost to its socket. "You sent the message?" he asked. She nodded once. "Why?" "Because he's going to kill someone." Her voice did not tremble. If anything, it carried a strange calm, as if the words had long since lost their power to frighten her. "Who?" "I don't know his name. Not really. Only what he told me." "And what was that?" She hesitated, eyes flicking toward the window, as though expecting a face to appear there. "He said his name was René, but it isn't. It never was." Moreau stepped closer. "Tell me everything." She sat on the edge of the bed, fingers clasped in her lap. "He came here 3 weeks ago. Said he was a travelling clerk looking for work at the quarry. But he asked too many questions, about the post office, about who rented which rooms. At first, I thought he was just lonely. We spoke sometimes in the evenings. Then one night, he told me something I can't forget." The rain began again outside, thin and steady, like a metronome marking her pauses. "He said he'd already chosen the man who had to die, that it was decided. When I asked why, he said some names don't deserve to live. I thought he was raving, until he described how it would happen, every detail." Her voice faltered for the first time. So I wrote to you. I didn't think you'd believe me." Moreau regarded her in silence. The lamplight caught the faint sheen of moisture on her cheeks. Not tears, perhaps, but the residue of sleeplessness. "What makes you certain he meant it?" "He left his knife on the table once," she said. "Clean, polished. He told me it cuts without sound." She shivered, though the room was not cold. Moreau lit his pipe, more for rhythm than comfort. "And where is this man now?" "I don't know. He left the morning before the telegram, said he was going to the river. But when he looked back, he smiled, as if he'd already done it." The inspector studied the desk. Beneath the sheets lay a small photograph, the edges curling. He picked it up. A group of quarry workers, faces grey with dust. One stood slightly apart, his features indistinct in the exposure, but the posture, upright, almost theatrical, caught Moreau's eye. "This him?" She nodded. "Yes, that's René." He slipped the photograph into his coat pocket. "And your name, mademoiselle?" For the first time she seemed uncertain. "Elise," she said finally, though it sounded like a word chosen rather than owned. Moreau inclined his head. "Very well, Elise. You'll remain here tonight. Lock the door. Speak to no one. I'll return in the morning." She rose. "If you find him," she said softly, "don't let him speak. Just don't listen." There was something desperate in her tone, something that didn't belong to ordinary fear. Back in the corridor, Moreau paused, hand on the rail. The smell of rain had deepened. Somewhere below, the landlady hummed to herself. He turned toward the small parlour at the end of the hall where guests sometimes left letters. On the mantel, beneath a vase of wilted carnations, he noticed another envelope, unaddressed, unsealed. Inside, a single scrap of paper. He unfolded it. "The river doesn't wash names away, it only hides them." He slipped it into his coat and left. Outside, the square lay drowned in mist. A single lantern burned near the fountain, its reflection rippling in the shallow puddles. Moreau stood there a long time, listening, not for footsteps, but for the silence between them. At dawn he returned to the boarding house. The door to room 4 stood open. The bed was empty, the shutters wide. The candle had burned itself to nothing, leaving a soft circle of wax on the desk. On the pillow lay another telegram, unsigned. "He's here." The ink was still wet. Moreau stepped back, heart tightening. The room smelled faintly of violets and cold air. Somewhere outside, a train whistle cried, distant, mournful, cutting through the fog. He looked once more at the telegram, at the simple, trembling words that seemed written in haste. Then, without another glance, he turned and descended the stairs 2 at a time. In the square, the dawn had begun to pale the rooftops. He could see the station lights flicker through the mist, and beyond them the river winding like a ribbon of lead. He knew now that the girl's fear was not for herself, but for something larger, the kind of terror that attaches itself to inevitability. He pulled his coat tighter, breath clouding in the chill air. Somewhere ahead, a man named René, or someone calling himself that, had already set the clock of death in motion. And yet what haunted Moreau most as he began to run was not the thought of the killer, but of the girl's voice repeating, "Don't let him speak." It echoed against the cobblestones, following him into the fog like the refrain of a dream he could not wake from. By the time Inspector Moreau reached the station, the fog had learned how to move. It flowed in slow, muscle-like contractions between the lampposts, gathered in doorways, curled over the rails as if tasting iron. The whistle he had heard from the square had already silenced itself. Only a low hiss of cooling metal remained. He searched the platform with his eyes, not for a face, but for the particular vacancy that follows fear. The night porter, a man with a scar that divided his brow like a river on a map, lifted his chin toward the river road. "There," he said, as though pointing to a sermon everyone already knew. "They ran that way." "Who?" Moreau asked. "The woman from the boarding house, for one, and a man I didn't recognize. Grey coat, hat pulled down, didn't speak. The girl did. She said—" He paused, looking as though he'd misplaced the words. "She said he was already late." Moreau moved past him without another question, down the shallow steps beside the station and along the river path where the gravel made a soft, tearing sound beneath his soles. The water ran heavy and slow, swollen by days of rain, carrying in its current dark leaves and the occasional shell of a chestnut. Across the river, low houses leaned toward their reflections, their shutters like closed eyelids. Ahead, faint and intermittent, he caught the sound of footsteps magnified by stone, a courtyard somewhere, a gate. He found the house by what it withheld, while the rest of the street allowed the new morning to pushing its way under doors and through curtains. This one seemed to refuse every inch of light. The gate stood ajar, the garden wet, the gravel untroubled by the usual scatter of birds. The brass plate on the door read Clement Aubry, Comptable, and beneath the name a smaller line, Consultations by appointment only. Inside, an old bell shivered a note when he pressed it, but there was no answer. Moreau tried the handle. It yielded. The foyer smelled of damp wool and ink. He stepped onto a runner that had drunk its fill of muddy shoes, and stood very still. Houses speak, if not with voices, then with a kind of grammar, the line of a carpet, a smear on a banister, a door drawn almost shut rather than properly so. On the left, a glass-panelled door gave onto a study. The key had been left on the inside. Moreau pushed. The door opened with a whisper, the glass trembling a delicate complaint. Clement Aubry sat at his desk, or rather upon it, his upper body listing forward so that his cheek rested against a scatter of bills and stamps. The wound at his throat had been made with a blade that understood the economy of flesh. It was not the work of rage, it was the work of intention. The knife was gone. There were no signs of struggle, only the odd, quiet disarray one sees in rooms where a man has tried to stand up to death and found it already seated. On the desk, a pocket watch lay open, its face thinly misted, as if the skin of time itself had breathed upon it. The hands had stopped at 5:20. Moreau listened. Somewhere deep in the house a clock continued to tick, relentlessly indifferent. He touched the watch with the back of his knuckle. Cold. The chain, too, held a memory of wet. He looked at the window, latched, yet a small tongue of rain had dried in a wavering line on the wooden frame, and on the sill a dark oval indicated where a wet hat might have rested for the length of a held breath. He did not call for anyone at once. The living are impatient around the dead, and impatience scrapes away the small truths that still cling to rooms such as this. He let the silence stretch, arranged it carefully within himself. The papers under Aubry's cheek were ordinary and then not, invoices, receipts, a blotting page with a recent imprint that read like a ghost of words, a red ledger open to yesterday. In the blotter's reversed text he could pick out, with the practice of years, a stand-alone name repeated twice, Leonette, and then the stroke of a pen that suggested either a flourish or fury. He filed it without comment. In the grate, ashes lay pale as talc. Moreau crouched. Among the ashes, light, almost insubstantial, he found the serpentine curl of burned paper that had not committed fully to its extinction. He touched it with a matchstick, and a corner of writing declared itself in the flame's brief courtesy. "Not to Paris, I will send." The rest blackened to lace, then memory. He felt a small ache of recognition. This was a room in which something had been decided long before he arrived. Now he called out, a single word that served as both summons and warning. "Janitor!" It took a moment. There are always moments in which houses delay their acknowledgement of the inevitable. Then a man appeared at the doorway, cap in hand, his face too pale to belong to someone accustomed to blood. Moreau showed him his badge. "Call the doctor and send for the gendarme. Close the gate." He remained alone until the doctor came, a thin man with nicotine fingers who smelled faintly of ether, even through the musk of the room. The doctor lifted Aubrey's head with a care that had little to do with tenderness and everything to do with habit. "An hour, perhaps," he said, examining the cooled edges of the wound. "Maybe a little less." The blood still had its zeal when it left him. "Did he have visitors?" Moreau asked the janitor, while the doctor packed away his threadbare certainties. "In the early morning." "No one comes to Monsieur Aubrey so soon," the man said, looking at the floor, as if the floor might punish him for the day's irregularity. "But I heard the gate, twice. Once, just before 5. Again, not long after. I thought it was the milkman." "You saw no one?" "No, Monsieur l'Inspecteur. The fog—" He gestured helplessly. Moreau's eyes returned to the desk. The chair had been drawn back as if someone had occupied it, and then risen without the scrape of wood on wood. On the blotter's margin, a small crescent of soot darkened the paper. He leaned closer. It was the print of a pipe bowl. Aubrey's own pipe stood cold beside a tin of tobacco, its stem angled toward the window, as though listening. That crescent did not belong to it. 2 smokers, then, one careful enough to leave with what he had brought. The doctor murmured a final routine and departed with the soft fatalism of men who traffic in ends. Moreau waited at the window while the gendarme arrived and made his officious notes in a little book that seemed to have more vanity than pages. When the formalities permitted silence again, Moreau opened the latch and lifted the window a fraction. The fog pressed in like an uninvited guest. On the exterior stone ledge, a smear of something darker than damp traced an arc. Not blood. Oil, perhaps. He dabbed it with his handkerchief. It smelled faintly of machine and sea. He thought of the river, of the boats that hunched under the bridges like beasts at tether. On the mantel, among framed photographs whose subjects had pruned themselves into propriety, Aubrey shaking hands with men of average consequence, Aubrey standing beside a woman who might have been a sister, there lay a matchbox. It did not belong to the room. Its paper sleeve was a vulgar blue, with a white anchor stamped at the centre and a name printed in cheap gilt, Café du Port. He turned it over with his thumb. 3 matches remained. He took them, returned the empty box to the mantel, and allowed himself the small inward nod that stands in for satisfaction when satisfaction is unseemly. The gendarme cleared his throat. "Inspector, will you be informing the prefecture?" "I will," Moreau said, though his voice had already travelled elsewhere, down to the quay where men drank early and spoke late, where a girl might be seen walking in the rain because hiding indoors had become impossible. He closed the window and latched it, then set the stopped pocket watch gently atop the ledger, as if reuniting 2 estranged cousins. When Elise arrived, it was with her hair damp and her gaze already prepared for something it had not wanted to see. She paused at the threshold, one hand on the wood as though asking its permission, then stepped inside. Her breath became very small. "I told you," she said, not accusing him, but the day itself. "He is late, and yet he is always on time." Moreau watched her rather than the body, watched the way her eyes avoided the desk, skimming the room's edges instead. Window, grate, mantel, door, the 4 corners of escape. "You were here," he said softly. It was not a question. She closed her eyes, opened them. "I followed him from the station." "René? Or the man who carries that name like a hat he can remove when it suits him?" He walked without hurry. When he reached the gate, he turned and looked at me. Not to threaten, more to ask whether I would remember this moment properly. "Did he go directly to the study?" "Yes." He knocked, twice. Not the knock of a stranger. The door opened. I couldn't see who opened it. I heard voices. Low, controlled. Then the other sound. She touched her throat briefly, then let the hand fall. He came out not long after. He put something in his pocket and went down to the quay. I ran to the station to send another telegram. When I returned, her eyes flicked to the desk once and away again. He had stopped the watch. He said he would. You spoke to him after? No. She swallowed. He speaks like a doorway in a dream. If you go through it, you will not remember how you arrived. Did anyone else see him? The fishmonger, a boy delivering milk, the river which sees everyone. She hesitated. Inspector, you must not let him tell you his name. Why? Because he will make it yours. That is what he does. Moreau drew a long breath, felt the bite of tobacco at the back of his throat, and welcomed it. He looked again at the matchbox on the mantel. Café du Port, a vulgar blue, an anchor. That kind of establishment does not ask for surnames. It asks for coin and silence. He put the 3 matches into his waistcoat pocket beside the scrap of burned paper, the handkerchief scented with oil, the photograph of quarry workers with a man standing slightly apart, as if distance were already a habit. He turned to Elise. You will go back to the boarding house. Pack. The landlady will tell you there are no trains. Tell her, Inspector Moreau says there is always a train. Return to Paris on the morning service. Janvier will meet you. He saw her ready a protest and added before it could grow teeth, if you remain, you will teach him how to find you. In Paris, I can teach him how to lose you. She nodded once, reluctantly, then looked again at the desk, at the body, whose stillness had now soaked into the furniture. Will he kill again? Moreau considered the window, the ash, the careful absence of the knife, the chosen stopping of a watch at 5:20. He has rehearsed himself, he said. Men who rehearse do not stop at the first performance. When she had gone, the room seemed to inhale. The gendarme shifted his boots, scratched at a note, tried to become smaller inside his uniform. Outside, somewhere far off, a boat released a sigh against its moorings. Moreau took one last walk around the study, collecting nothing, touching nothing, yet allowing the room to settle into the fixed shape it would hold in memory. Then he closed the door behind him and stepped into the corridor where the wallpaper repeated its roses so insistently one might have mistaken insistence for purity. In the foyer, he paused to look at the umbrella stand. One umbrella missing, wet rings on the tile where it had been. The janitor watched him with the dull alarm of a man who fears every discovery will bloom into accusation. Inspector, he ventured. You will arrange for the body to be moved when the doctor gives permission, Moreau said gently. And you will forget the little things you noticed. They will try to make you remember them later with more exactness than you possess. Refuse them that cruelty. He stepped into the morning. The fog had thinned to gauze. The river carried its secrets toward the sea, where even names fatigue. He walked the quay until the air changed and the street learned to laugh again, however briefly. Then he found the place he had already been told to look for, a low building with salt-damp walls and a signboard picturing an anchor in white paint already retreating from itself. Café du Port. Even at this hour, men sat beneath the awning with their collars turned up, their eyes hidden behind steam from bowls of coffee that pretended to be soup. Moreau halted at the threshold, removed his hat, and let the smell of boiled chicory, wet rope, and tobacco enter him. He was not yet ready to speak. He preferred to listen first to the scrape of chairs, the coughs that carry a name without daring to pronounce it, the flick and strike of a match against the blue paper sleeve that had fallen open on a dead man's mantle. Somewhere within this room, the rehearsal continued. Somewhere, a man who borrowed names was deciding which one to return to the river. The Café du Port was the kind of place that forgot its own mornings. It wore the smell of last night's tobacco like a uniform, the air thick with smoke that seemed to hang not from the ceiling, but from the memories of men who had never quite left. Moreau stepped through the doorway, pausing just long enough to allow the damp light from the street to lose its courage. The interior was dim, its corners soft with shadow. A cracked mirror behind the counter returned a distorted version of the room where every patron appeared to be watching himself age. The barkeep, a man with shoulders broad as his silences, nodded once in greeting. He was polishing a glass that no cloth could ever make clean. Moreau removed his hat and set it on the counter. "Black coffee," he said. "And information, if it costs the same." The barkeep's smile barely happened. "Depends on the kind of information." "About a man who calls himself René." The glass paused mid-polish. For a moment, only the hiss of the percolator spoke. Then the barkeep placed the glass upside down on the shelf. "A lot of men call themselves that. It's a name that travels well. This one travels with a knife." That earned a look, brief and measuring. "Then you should ask the river. It carries more knives than I do." Moreau sipped his coffee in silence. It was bitter enough to wake the dead. Around him, the cafe's regulars played their parts with the well-rehearsed indifference of witnesses who had long ago decided what they hadn't seen. Sailors, dockhands, one or two men in cheap suits pretending to be merchants. The smoke made their faces indistinct, as though guilt itself had learned to exhale. From the far end of the bar, a voice murmured, "René?" A man with a limp leaned forward, his elbows on the counter. He had the kind of face that could not decide between defiance and fatigue. "He was here," the man said, "couple of nights ago, sat at that table by the stove, didn't drink much, just listened." "To what?" Moreau asked. "To everyone. He had a way of making you think you were saying more than you meant." "And then?" "He left, with a girl." Moreau's eyes lifted. "Describe her?" "Dark hair, eyes like someone who already knows the ending." "Elise." "Of course," the man shrugged. They didn't talk, just walked out together. She kept looking behind her, though, like she was waiting to see if her shadow was following. The barkeep returned, setting another cup beside Moreau's. "He left something," he said. "Didn't come back for it." From beneath the counter he produced a small book bound in cracked leather, the kind of thing no one would miss unless it contained something meant never to be found. Moreau opened it. Inside, the pages were filled with neat, looping handwriting. Lists of names, numbers, addresses, some crossed out, others underlined. Among them, one name appeared more than once, Clement Aubry. Each time it was marked with a small circle, drawn with deliberate care. On the final page, a single line stood alone. "The water remembers." He closed the book gently as though it might bruise. "When did he leave this?" "The night of the storm," the barkeep said. "Told me he'd be back for it after the tide turned. I didn't ask what he meant. I don't ask questions I don't want the answers to." Moreau slipped the book into his coat. "If he returns, tell him Inspector Moreau is looking for him." The barkeep frowned. "And if he asks where to find you?" Moreau met his gaze. "Tell him he already does." Outside, the wind had shifted. The fog that had clung to the river all morning began to rise in thin, uncertain threads. He followed the quay toward the docks, the smell of salt and diesel mingling with that of rotting wood. Ships groaned against their moorings, men shouted somewhere downriver, though the words were indistinct, half labour, half warning. He stopped near a pile of fishing nets where a boy sat smoking a cigarette, far too confidently for his age. The boy looked up, wary but curious. "You're the inspector," he said. "The one asking about the man from the cafe." Moreau nodded. "You saw him?" "Twice. First night he came, he asked me about the tides. Second night he asked about the girl." "What did you tell him?" "That she lived near the square. That she watched the water, even when it wasn't moving." The boy hesitated. "He gave me this." From his pocket, he produced a silver coin, one side polished smooth, the other engraved with a faint symbol, an anchor surrounded by a circle. Did he say what it meant? He said it was for luck, but it didn't sound like a blessing. Moreau took the coin, turning it in his palm. The edges were worn as though it had been passed through too many hands, each leaving a little of its story behind. He handed it back. "Keep it. Sometimes luck knows where it belongs." The boy nodded, pocketing it quickly. "If you find him," he said, "don't look at his eyes too long. People say they change color when he lies." Moreau smiled faintly. Then he must never blink. He left the key and made his way back toward the square. The afternoon had become a dull, uncertain grey, the kind of light that makes everything appear older. The town seemed smaller now, as though it had drawn in upon itself. Near the church, he noticed a man nailing a sheet of paper to the bulletin board. Moreau paused to read it. Reward for information leading to the capture of the murderer of Clement Aubry. Beneath it, an artist's rough sketch, a face that could belong to anyone or to no one. He stood a long while looking at it. The lines were vague, the jaw uncommitted, the eyes little more than smudges. It reminded him of fog trying to take human form. Then he realized what unsettled him most. The face in the sketch looked faintly like his own. Back at the inn, the landlady met him with a look that was neither surprise nor relief. "The girl is gone again," she said. "Left before dawn, didn't say where." Moreau closed his eyes briefly. "Did she leave anything?" The woman hesitated. "A coat, and this." She handed him a small folded paper, still damp at the edges. Inside, written in hurried script, "He's closer than you think. Don't listen when he speaks." For a moment, the inspector said nothing. He folded the paper again and slipped it into his pocket with the others. The telegram, the scrap from the fire, the photograph. Together they formed a pattern he could almost see, though it refused to name itself. Outside, the bells of Saint-Lazare began to toll the hour. The sound rolled through the mist like a warning or a promise. Moreau looked toward the river. Somewhere, beneath its shifting skin, something waited, a truth not yet spoken, or perhaps a lie already too old to die. He turned up his collar and began to walk. The cafe was behind him now, but its smoke seemed to follow, curling invisibly through the air, clinging to his thoughts like an aftertaste. He had the sense that everything around him, the cobblestones, the shutters, the river itself, was holding its breath, waiting for him to ask the one question that would make the whole town exhale. But he did not ask. Not yet. Some questions were doors that, once opened, could never again be closed. The afternoon folded into evening as if the town had decided to protect itself by becoming less visible. Doors shut earlier. Lamps were lit with an economy that seemed moral rather than practical. Moreau walked as daylight thinned, passing the square where the fountain held only a rainwater sky. He did not go back to the Café du Port. Smoke tells you yesterday's truths. He wanted something that had not yet learned how to lie. The house of Clement Aubry waited with its gate slightly ajar, the hinge cured of protest by the damp. The janitor had gone. The gendarme had been replaced by a note beneath the bell announcing that the premises were sealed until the morning. Seals can be opened by the same silence that protects them. He let himself in. Inside, the study had cooled into a room that remembered everything except warmth. The desk had been tidied out of respect for a man beyond the reach of order, papers squared into obedient stacks, the blotter, with its faint reversed name, turned face down by hands that feared the indecency of legible ghosts. Moreau did not restore disorder. He stood and listened. Houses at night keep a different grammar, pipes ticking, a stare that speaks for no reason, glass turning the small sounds of the street into slow vowels. It was all there, the alphabet of emptiness. And underneath it, something else. A thin, unsatisfied breath. He crossed to the hearth. The ash had been clumsily gathered, as if ashamed of having once been a letter, a ledger, a life. He knelt and stirred it with the burnt end of a match. The fragments that rose were too far gone to confess. But along the baseboard, behind the fender, he noticed a thin seam of dust interrupted by a clean line not wide enough for a broom. He moved the fender, set his fingertips to the board nearest the desk, and pressed. The board did not lift. It yielded a fraction, then thought better of it. He pressed again, this time with the heel of his hand, just to the right of a knot where wood remembers the tree it once was. The board came up with a small domestic sigh. In the cavity lay a packet tied with string. The string had bitten into the paper enough to leave its pattern. Whoever tied it had known this would not be opened by accident. He set the packet on the desk, cut the string with his penknife, and unfolded the paper. Inside there was only one letter, folded in thirds. The date, 2 days before the murder. The address, Paris, Rue du Bac, Maître Vanel, Advocate. The salutation was formal in its obedience and feverish beneath it. Sir, you will forgive the tardiness of a man who believed that time would grow tired of him first. Moreau read without moving his lips. The words were careful, the way a guilty man arranges his hair for a photograph. Aubrey spoke of accounts not his to keep, of figures washed and set out to dry until they looked innocent. He wrote of a quarry company that never bothered to distinguish stone from men, of a silent partner who preferred to exist as rumour, of a debt that had not been paid because every time it neared the door, someone turned down the lamp. Twice, perhaps 3 times, the name Leonet appeared. Without given name, only the surname like a bell that had forgotten who rang it. Aubrey wrote that Leonet had introduced him to a young stenographer whose hand could make the crooked look straight. A girl with a borrowed family, he wrote, and a talent for listening to what she is told not to hear. A line later, he underlined a single name, Elise, twice, as if to nail it to the page against escape. The letter did not accuse, it anticipated. If anything should befall me, it read, I ask that you place this in the care of the prefecture, for there are names that the river would be only too glad to adopt and drown. I am at last ashamed to have been chosen as a vessel for such men. I am told there is no sin in carrying water. I find there is when the bucket leaks into a grave. He wrote that he had set aside documents to support his confession, drafts, lists, a small book of names and numbers that should never have belonged to a cafe but did. He wrote that he would send them tomorrow, though the sentence that promised that duty trembled under his pen as if a hand had touched his shoulder. If the tide allows, the letter ended, you will have the rest. There was no signature, only the pressure of a name that had been written and then pressed hard enough to become invisible. Moreau laid the page down and stood at the window. The street had sunk further into itself, a lamp circling a small island of pavement where moths rehearsed their bad decisions. He thought of the name on the blotter, Leonet, and of the name underlined, Elise. He thought of a girl whose first word in every room was silence, whose warning had been constant and curious. Do not listen. He thought of the small book with its vulgar blue matchbox for an escort, now in his coat. He thought of a river that remembers everything except to be merciful. He folded the letter along its old creases, slipped it into an inner pocket, and restored the floorboard. The room felt lighter for a moment, as though a confession put to rest had relieved the furniture of its complicity. Before leaving, he walked once around the desk without touching it, letting each object declare itself. The brass pen with its nib cleaned more thoroughly than the man who wiped it, the blotter whose reversed world showed the name Leonet with the stubbornness of a stain, the ledger with yesterday's line left impatiently unruled, the pipe print not belonging to Aubrey, and the air, still faintly machine oil and damp rope, of a visitor whose pockets preferred the key to the bank. Outside, the rain had grown polite, the kind that does not ask you to hurry. He cut across the square toward the post office. A young clerk with the anxious eyelashes of the innocent looked up from his stool as Moreau entered, then down again, as if crime might be contagious through the eyes. The inspector laid his badge on the counter and placed a coin beside it, a coin the boy would be permitted to refuse, but would not. 2 days ago, Moreau said, Monsieur Aubry would have posted a letter to Paris. To Maître Vanel. Did it leave? The clerk consulted his ledger, its columns, promising a world in which everything is where it said it would be. One to Paris, yes. Collected yesterday morning on the first post. Addressee Vanel. He paused. But there was confusion with the delivery cart. The road by the river was flooded. The bags were delayed. Some were taken last night by special train. Others... He swallowed. We were instructed to hold them. There were complaints. Who instructed you? Someone from the mairie. I don't know his name. He said the prefecture would prefer to know. He looked wretched at his own confession. I locked them in the back. Moreau waited. The boy brought out a canvas sack, its mouth knotted, a paper seal half-hearted and wholly municipal. He upended the bag onto the counter, letters fanned like the wings of dull birds. Moreau sorted gently, his hands moving with that calm peculiar to men who have learned the cost of haste. There, Aubry's hand, the particular Y that looped on its way to Grace. He checked the address. Rue du Bac, the stamp, unfranked, the seal unbroken. The envelope, as pure as the intent behind it, was not. He replaced it in the bag and tied the string. These will go now, he said. On the next train, if the tide allows, as Monsieur Aubry might have said. The clerk nodded too quickly. Yes, Inspector. Back in the street, Moreau turned the problem until light caught its roughness. Aubry had written a confession, but hidden a copy here, had addressed a lawyer who would bring the prefecture into the room via the clean staircase of procedure, had prepared attachments that matched what was now in Moreau's pocket, a book of names with circles drawn around a comptable who had died according to the rehearsal he feared. Between the letter and its attachments there was a missing thing, the name of the man who borrowed other names, René, the travelling clerk who asked about rooms and tides, and the distance between a girl and a knife. The letter offered him only through negative space the shape of a lie with no edges. Aubry feared him, but did not write him. That omission had weight. At the boarding-house, the landlady met Moreau at the foot of the stairs as if summoned by the sound of his shoe on the 7th tread. She held a coat folded over her arm, the cheap wool made stiff by drying rain. She paid for the week, the landlady said, but she won't use it. You told her to leave. She did as she was told. Did she say where? She said the river would tell you. He took the coat from her. In one pocket, a handkerchief, clean but folded and refolded to the point of weariness. In the other, a small slip of paper with a line of numbers that might be a train time or a sum owed with no one left to pay it. Something crackled in the lining where the seam had come untrue. He slipped 2 fingers through the gap and drew out a ticket stub, Paris, 2nd class, yesterday morning, along with a sliver of photographic paper cut irregularly from a larger print. The fragment showed the edge of a shoulder, a lapel with a tear neatly mended, and the corner of a sign behind the figure, the letters N-E-T above a painted anchor, not a shop, a signboard. The café had once been photographed by someone proud of it or suspicious of it. He kept the fragment, returned the coat. On the stairs he paused. The door of room 4 was shut. He opened it. The desk was as she had left it, except for the candle reduced to a castle of cooled drips. He lifted the blotter and found beneath it the faint shadow of writing where the pressure of a pen had been enough to bruise the wood. He held the page at an angle to the light. The words offered themselves by reluctance. When he says his name, do not answer. He stood a long while there, as if the sentence could be overheard by the person it feared. Night gathered itself in corners. He took the late train to Paris, the compartment almost empty, the lamp overhead, turning the window into a mirror that returned a man, whose face had been sketched that morning on a public sheet as if the town had wanted to be rid of him by any means available. The wheels found their rhythm and kept it. At each stop, a little Sleep climbed aboard and looked around for somewhere to sit, but did not find a place. Moreau did not try to rest. He read Aubrey's letter again in the bad light until the words taught him nothing new, then put it away and watched the country slide past as though it were being erased. Paris received him with the kind of indifference that absolves the guilty and comforts the honest. At Quai des Orfèvres, Janvier had left a note. The prefect wanted an update before morning, and Lucas had been instructed to inquire discreetly at the Café du Port's suppliers. The note included a small observation like a gift left by a friend who knows when silence is a burden. The girl arrived. She would not give her surname. She insists on seeing you. She says she has brought you a name and asks that you refuse it. He found her in the small interview room that pretended to be warmer than it was with the help of a lamp and a worn blanket. Elise stood when he entered. The colour in her face had not returned to stay. It visited, then left by the same door. On the table between them lay a folded sheet. She did not touch it. "What is this?" he asked. "A letter," she said. "Not mine, not any more. He gave it to me to copy. He told me to send it and then to stop it. He wanted to see which would be faster, the train or your caution. I made my choice. I don't know if it was the right one." She pushed the sheet toward him. It was a copy of Aubrey's letter, word for word, except where her pen had hesitated, at the surname Lyonnais and at the name she had underlined twice. She looked at him, finally, and in her gaze there was the courage of someone who has decided that fear might be more useful worn on the outside. "Who are you, Elise?" he asked, not with suspicion, but with the fatigue of a man who has run beside a river longer than intended. She opened her mouth, as if to speak the answer she had carried like a stone. Then she closed it, shook her head once, and said only, "If I tell you, he will have something to take." He did not press. He placed Aubrey's original beside her copy. 2 confessions, one unsent, one misplaced, and between them a girl who might be a witness, a messenger, or the message itself. He thought of the warning that had followed him since the first telegram. Do not listen. It is the kind of instruction a man keeps until he breaks it at the precise moment when obedience becomes betrayal. "Tomorrow," he said, "we go to the river." She nodded. "He will be there. He always is after he names himself." "And if he speaks?" She looked at the lamp, its flame holding steady against a draught that would not admit itself. "Then you will need a silence stronger than his voice." He folded both letters and slipped them into his coat. The room's small heat had begun to lose its argument with the stone. Somewhere in the building, a clock accepted the burden of the coming hour and shouldered it into being. Moreau stood, and she stood with him, and the space between them was filled with the kind of understanding that has no shape until it is broken by action. The prefecture was never built for light. Its corridors belonged to a colour that had forgotten its own name, a mixture of paper dust, tobacco, and the patient smell of old secrets. Moreau arrived before dawn, his coat still carrying the memory of the river. The clerks were just beginning their rituals, lamps being lit, ink bottles opened, typewriters coaxed awake by reluctant fingers. He walked past them without greeting, his boots finding the rhythm that meant he had something the building would not want to hear. At his office, Janvier waited. The young inspector looked older in the grey light, eyes ringed from a night of unfinished reports. He rose when Moreau entered. "You've seen her?" Moreau nodded. "She's in the interview room. She brought a letter, a copy of Aubrey's confession." "Then she's in deeper than we thought," Janvier said quietly. "Or clearer." They stood a moment in silence, the paper on the desk whispering beneath the draft. Then Janvier spoke again. The prefect knows. Word reached him before you came back. He's called for you. Of course he had. The prefect was a man who believed silence should only exist when he permitted it. Moreau straightened his tie, wiped a thumb across the dust on his sleeve, and went. The prefect's office looked out over the Seine, a view that existed solely to remind its occupant that power, like water, moves best when contained. The man himself stood at the window, hands behind his back. His voice, when it came, was smooth enough to pass for calm. Aubrey's death has made the papers, the press is hungry again, and the ministry dislikes hunger it didn't order. They say you have a witness. A girl, Moreau said. Elise, she may have been his stenographer. The prefect turned. His eyes were pale, the kind that measured obedience before truth. And you believe her? I believe she's afraid. That's not the same thing. No, Moreau said softly. But fear has better instincts than most of us. The prefect came closer, the faint scent of cologne carrying something sharper beneath it, a warning disguised as refinement. You've done good work before, Moreau. That's why I tolerate your manner. But this time you'll hand it over. Janvier can finish. The newspapers are circling, and the ministry wants closure. You understand? Moreau met his gaze without effort. I understand that closure is a dangerous habit. The prefect smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. You're tired. Take a few days. We'll manage. I'll need access to the river files, Moreau said, as if the conversation had gone another way. Every unidentified body in the last month, and any references to the name Leonette. Something flickered across the prefect's expression. Not surprise, exactly, but the brief tightening of a man who hears his own name whispered at a distance. That name means nothing here, he said. Then it won't trouble you to let me check. For a moment, neither moved. Then the prefect turned back to the window. You'll find the river keeps better records than men do. Moreau left without answering. The corridor outside felt colder. Bureaucracy has its own temperature, the chill of paper that has outlived the hands that wrote it. He walked back to his office, where Janvier was waiting with 2 cups of coffee that had already gone tepid. What did he say? That I'm tired. Janvier smirked. He's not wrong. No, Moreau said, but he's unhelpful. He dropped the prefect's words into silence, where they could lose their strength. I need you to trace Leonet, cross-check with Aubrey's correspondence, trade directories, anything that connects him to the quarry accounts, discreetly. Janvier nodded, already reaching for his files. And the girl? She stays here, Moreau said. No one sees her without my permission. She'll have a room upstairs. Guard it like confession. When Janvier was gone, Moreau sat and stared at the letters spread before him. 2 versions of the same guilt, one in Aubrey's precise hand, one in Elise's, uncertain and trembling. Between them lay a third, invisible letter written by the city itself, in smoke and silence. He lit his pipe, leaned back, and let the smoke curl toward the ceiling like the question he no longer wanted answered. Why him? Why Moreau? Who had chosen his name for the telegram? There was a knock, not Janvier. He knew that rhythm, patient, too polite to belong to authority. He opened the door to find a man in civilian clothes, the kind whose collar is too stiff for honesty. From the prefect, the man said, handing over an envelope. Your case file. Moreau waited until he'd gone before opening it. Inside were 3 sheets, the official report of Aubrey's death, the doctor's notes, and a statement, unsigned, claiming responsibility for the investigation's reassignment to another division. He turned the last page over. There, faintly impressed in the paper's weave, were 2 words that did not belong, Leonette Division. He frowned. There was no such unit. The prefecture's bureaucracy was many things. Bloated, vain, occasionally cruel, but not inventive. He rose and walked to the records room, The clerk on duty looked up in alarm as if caught stealing time. "Inspector Moreau, you're not on the list." "Then I'll write myself in," he said, and the clerk decided to busy himself elsewhere. Rows upon rows of drawers lined the room, each marked by a number that pretended to contain truth. He found the river records first, folders yellowed to the color of old teeth. The recent months offered nothing unusual: a few drownings, 2 suicides, a body found near Asnières with pockets empty and eyes open. Then in the March file he saw it, an entry redacted in heavy pencil, but the name still visible beneath the pressure marks: Lyonnais, Victor. He copied the address, Rue du Bac, the same street as Maître Vanel. Back in his office, Elise waited. She had removed her gloves, but not her fear. "You went to the prefect," she said. He nodded. "He's not pleased." "He wouldn't be. He knows the name." Moreau's eyes narrowed. "You've heard it before." She hesitated, then drew a small, folded note from her sleeve. "He sent this to me once. Told me to keep it until the right man asked for it." Moreau unfolded it carefully. Inside was a single line written in a hurried, uneven hand. "The prefecture casts longer shadows than it admits." He looked up. "And you think Lyonnais wrote this?" "No," she said. Renee did. The air between them changed. It thickened as though the room itself wished to leave. "He wanted me to deliver it," Elise continued, her voice steady now, the tremor replaced by something colder. "To you." Moreau exhaled slowly. The pieces were beginning to form a pattern too symmetrical to be chance. A murdered accountant, a forged identity, a girl who warned him not to listen, and a man who somehow knew which inspector would follow the trail. "Why you?" he asked quietly. "Why did he choose you to send the telegram?" She looked away. "Because I said your name first." He frowned. "How?" "I was typing a report one night at the prefecture, months ago. The case files were dull, routine. They mentioned you. He was standing behind me, pretending to read. He asked who you were. I said you were a man who never believed what he wanted to." He smiled. "And then?" He said, "Then he will believe me." Moreau's pipe went out. He didn't bother to relight it. Outside, the bells of Notre Dame struck noon, each note carrying the heavy indifference of time. The sound rolled through the city, into the Seine, and back through the prefecture's walls, like the echo of a decision that had already been made. "Janvier?" Moreau said quietly. His assistant appeared at once. "Get me everything on Victor Lyonnais and find out who issued that reassignment order." Janvier nodded and vanished. Elise rose. "You can't fight him," she said. "He's already inside the prefecture. He's not a man, not anymore." Moreau gave a thin smile. "No one who knows the prefecture believes in men anymore." He turned toward the window. The Seine moved sluggishly below, grey as mercury, carrying secrets toward the sea. In its reflection, the towers of Paris looked like gravestones. Somewhere downriver, perhaps near the Café du Port, a man named René was waiting, or something that used the name as a mask. And if Elise was right, he was no longer outside the investigation. He was within it, walking the same corridors, reading the same reports, signing orders that made other men disappear. Moreau's fingers brushed the letter in his pocket, Aubrey's confession, a ghost of ink and regret, and he felt a strange certainty settle in him like cold steel. This case had never been about the murder of one man. It was about who still lived under borrowed names. "Tomorrow," he said softly, almost to himself, "we'll see what the prefecture keeps in its shadows. Rain makes promises in Paris that the morning never remembers." It began before midnight and did not stop, a steady beading on the stone that made the arches of the bridges glisten like the backs of sleeping animals. Moreau left the prefecture without ceremony, his hat low, the letters in his pocket carrying their private weather. He walked south until the streets learned the slope toward the river, and the smell changed from coal and cabbage to wet rope, tar, and the iron breath of the Seine. Beneath Pont-Marie, the water spoke in a low voice, a conversation older than guilt. He waited there, where the city forgets its manners. He didn't have to look up to know he was no longer alone. The presence came first as a distortion in the rain, a veil disturbed by a body that preferred to pass through walls. Moreau turned only when the footfall made the briefest error of weight on the slick stone. Elise stood at the edge of the arch's shadow, her coat darker for the wet, her hair released in strands that clung to her temples. There was a second figure behind her, no more than a shade where the lamplight failed. "You chose the place," she said, and her voice carried none of the small tremors it had owned in rooms. Here, with the river as witness, she spoke as if words might at last keep their shape. "The river remembers," Moreau said. "It's in your book." She flinched at that, the small acknowledgement of a thread pulled without her seeing. The shade behind her shifted, drawing nearer, the brim of a hat, the outline of a face, the patience of a man who lets others start his sentences for him. "Inspector," he said. The voice was unremarkable and therefore impossible to forget. "You've been courteous to the dead. I wondered when you'd remember the living." Moreau didn't answer. He had learned, long ago on other nights by other rivers, that a silence timed correctly is heavier than a blow. He kept his eyes on Elise. "You asked for this," he said. "You told me the river would bring us to the truth if we let it." "I said it would bring us," she replied. "I didn't say what the truth would do when it arrived." The man moved forward into the narrow wash of the lamp until his face took shape, ordinary, almost careful in its symmetry. It was the kind of face people forget and therefore carry with them. "At last," he said, and the rain seemed to adjust itself to the cadence of his words. "We should not be clumsy now. Names are delicate things." Elise put a hand out, not to touch him, but to keep him from stepping closer. "Don't," she said. "Not yet." "You warned him not to listen," the man said, and smiled without showing his teeth. "You were right to do that. But then, lies are often useful when they lean in the direction of safety." He turned to Moreau. "May I offer you one? It's the least I can do after all your walking." Moreau drew the small matchbox from his pocket, the vulgar blue with the white anchor, and turned it once between his fingers, measuring its weight against the night. "I prefer debts to be settled in light," he said, and struck a match. For an instant the arch was a cave of amber, the rain hissed at the flame, and the man's pupils folded smaller, like shutters. Moreau cupped the match in his palm and lifted it toward the lowest stones of the arch, where the mortar had been scarred by an old mark. 3 short strokes cut into the seam, so faint the river had almost erased them. The light found them and made them new. The man laughed softly. "You've done your reading, harbour marks, signals for men who prefer to meet their futures in places the city does not register. I used to keep them neat." He tilted his head. "You want my name." "I want your purpose," Moreau said. "That's not what the telegram asked," the man replied, and Elise closed her eyes, as if the word itself were a stone thrown into her. "It said she knew my name. A tidy hook. The prefecture swallows hooks when the bait tastes of urgency." He took one more step, slow enough to be polite, and in the lamp's fraying circle, Elise's hand hovered near his sleeve, not a request, not a plea, simply a measure of distance. "Let me tell it properly," she said to Moreau, and if there was a confession in her tone, it was the kind that refuses to kneel. "You'll write it in your head anyway. Better I speak. I came to the prefecture because a man named Leonet found me in a stenographer's pool and said I had a talent for accuracy. He was right. He dictated numbers that wanted to be something else, and I gave them the shapes they believed would save them. At first it felt like cleanliness. Then it didn't. He introduced me to a client who called himself René and never the same surname twice. I typed his reports too, about river cargoes, tenders, the quarry, rumours of men who were paid to look the other way, and men who were paid to ensure there was nothing to see. When I hesitated, he said names were only a kind of clothing. Some you wear until the season changes. The man, René or whatever the night required, watched her with an interest too steady to be simple. "She is exact," he said to Moreau. "It is why I liked her. Accuracy is the most dangerous mercy." Elise drew breath and went on. "I copied a letter for Aubrey 2 days before he died, wrote to an advocate and underlined my name as if to fix me to the page. I went to the station after I saw that underline. I sent the telegram because I suddenly knew that if a murder was to be stopped, it wouldn't be by the men who had taught me how to spell their lies. It had to be someone who had never used my name. You. I sent only what you would follow. A promise." She swallowed. "A promise I made without permission to give it." "And the name?" Moreau asked. "Whose was it? The one you said you knew?" She looked past him at the river, where the black water gathered the rain into a ruined silk. "Mine," she said. "I knew the only name I could lose without the city noticing. If I told you his, the prefecture would fold it until it fit in its pocket. I told you mine so you would come and stand here and not let him speak." The man's smile altered so slightly it was possible it hadn't. "You see? Useful lies." "You killed Aubrey," Moreau said, and made it not an accusation but the sentence a room had already written. The man shook his head as if refusing a coat that didn't belong to him. "I removed an obstruction." He had prepared a letter to announce storms the ministry preferred to schedule. He stopped counting when I asked him to. He started writing when I left. "Men are inconsistent animals. I offer consistency." He looked up into the arch as though considering which stone to choose for his next word. "But you want the smaller theatre because it fits in a report. Very well. I went before dawn. I knocked as a friend knocks." He opened. We spoke. He raised his hand to show me he could still be reasonable. I let the knife do the rest. When it was quiet, I stopped his watch at the time we had discussed the week before, when he still believed a calendar can defend a man. I took nothing. I left him exactly as he had made his life, in order. Elise flinched again. Moreau said nothing. He could hear the river gnaw softly at the pilings, the wet thread of sound that loops between one city and another. "You talk like a magistrate," Moreau said, "but you're only a clerk of endings." "Clerks make the world," the man answered, not offended. "They decide which names are carried forward and which are drowned on paper before the body learns how to sink." He looked down at the slick cobbles and then at Moreau's hand, where the spent match had blackened to a thin rib. "Shall we stop being elegant? The prefect wants your file. He wants your girl. He will invent an office to carry you away if you do not come quietly. Leonet did not die when the river took him. He changed departments. He is a rumor that signs orders. We are all in his handwriting now." "That's talk," Moreau said, "not proof." "Proof is for daylight. I work for cities that prefer to lock their doors before morning." He inclined his head toward Elise, almost a bow. "She brought you to me because she knows you gather proofs and arrange them in drawers like moths. She believes you can keep me from naming myself to you. She thinks names have power. She is right." He straightened. "So let me give you mine and watch you carry it like a lit taper through rooms that smell of stale permission." Elise moved. It was only a step, but it put her between them, her coat an unadorned flag. "Don't," she whispered, and the word seemed to bruise itself against the stone. "You said I should keep a silence stronger than your voice. I have." Moreau realized, in the measured quiet that followed, that her caution had not been fear of a spell, but of a transaction. The name was a contract. To take it would be to enter a circle drawn by a hand that enjoyed geometry. He could almost feel the circumference at his feet. He let the second match rest in the box and did not strike it. "You think a name will make me responsible for you," he said to the man, "for your crimes, your corridors, your tepid offices, your convenient drownings. You think I'll become your clerk." "I think you already are," the man answered gently. "You came when summoned. You looked where I asked you to. You found what I left for you to find. I am only saving you the trouble of pretending otherwise." Elise's breath caught, a sound so small the rain nearly swallowed it. "Tell him the rest," she said. "Tell him what you told me by the key when you said you'd chosen the hour." The man's gaze softened, or pretended to. "That there would be another," he said, as if offering a cigarette to a friend who had already refused. That practice improves performance. The quarry accounts are not a single man's sin, they are a habit. Tomorrow, perhaps the day after, we will require another hour stopped at another desk. Unless, he lifted a hand, palm up, as if weighing fog. Unless someone decides their name can serve in place of another's, unless the prefecture is given a culprit it understands how to file. "You will not have her," Moreau said. "I didn't ask for her." The man's eyes found Moreau's and stayed there, level, grey, a tide, deciding whether to rise. "I asked for you." The shape of the choice arrived then, clean as a blade. Accept a name and become its steward. Refuse it and watch the river write one more obituary for a man whose ledger had too many tongues. The arch caught the rain and brought it down in fine curtains between them. Moreau felt the weight of his matches, the paper heat of letters against his ribs, the remembered imprint of a pocket-watch face that had mistaken punctuality for absolution. "Tell me what Lyonnais is," he said at last, low. "Not who, what?" "A habit in a good suit," the man said. "A drawer you open when you need somewhere to put the truth, a division that exists only when it is useful to panic. A man once. Yes, the river. Keeps his bones. But we prefer to keep the name. It is lighter." Elise took another small step, forward rather than back. "And me?" she asked. "What am I to you in this game of drawers?" "A stenographer," he said kindly. "A clean pair of hands." She closed her eyes and then opened them with something that looked very like contempt. "Not any more." Moreau let the final match strike. He held the flame up until it found the underside of the arch, where an old rope hung in a hard, black knot used years ago to moor police boats, and then forgotten. The light touched it, and he saw what he had hoped, a scrap of cloth tied there, tiny as a prayer flag, recent enough that the rain had not yet unravelled it. Janvier's sign. The boy had understood him after all. Somewhere above, at the bridge's far lip, boots shifted. The echo moved like a new weather. The man cocked his head, not surprised, only a touch amused. "You brought company." "Sometimes," Moreau said, "we remember the living." "Company changes nothing," the man said mildly. "Arrest me, and you will still need a name that satisfies men who distrust daylight. Refuse, and tomorrow you will find another watch that has learned obedience." He lifted 2 fingers from his hat brim in a gesture that could have been mockery or courtesy, and took a single step back into the darker splay of the arch. "When you are ready to stop rehearsing honesty, you know where to send for me." "Don't speak it," Elise said again, so softly the word had to shine to be heard. Moreau did not. He let the flame climb his fingers until pain reminded him he was not a theory. He shook the match out. In the instant of returned darkness, the space under the bridge rearranged itself. Boots above, a shout swallowed by rain. The man's outline turned and slid along the wet stone with a confidence that belonged to someone who knows every failure by its first name. Moreau moved to follow, but Elise's hand caught his sleeve. Not to restrain, to anchor. "Let him go," she said. "If you chase him down a corridor built of his names, you will end in his office." He stood very still and listened to the sound of a body leaving a place. It is different from footsteps. It is a subtraction. When he could no longer hear even the subtraction, he looked at the river. It received the rain and pretended not to be changed by it. "Tomorrow," Elise said. "You said it in the prefecture. Tomorrow we will see what it keeps in its shadows." He nodded. The night had not delivered him a criminal to display. It had given him a confession that broke not like a wave, but like a whisper against stone. The name she had spoken first had been her own, and it had saved her by purchasing his belief with honesty's coin flipped onto its other side. The case had opened, yes, but it had opened inward into the rooms of the city where files were closets for weather, and Lyonnais could be a body, a department, a rumour, or a key. The first tug of dawn was a pallor along the low clouds, not light exactly, but a loosening. Paris began to speak in metal and hooves. Above them the bridge learned its shape again. Moreau took Elise's arm because the steps were slick and because courtesy is a kind of resistance. They climbed together into a morning that had not asked for them. The bells at Notre Dame were only a promise yet. The hour had not decided if it would arrive. A cart rattled past, harness jingling. A barge exhaled below as if relieved to see them leave. They walked toward the prefecture, where rooms waited that had never learned how to forget. The letters battered lightly against his ribs with each step, like small hearts that had decided to live. Dawn crawled over the city, not as a herald of peace, but as a precise observer, illuminating the sharp edges of things that had been blurred by night. It glanced off the wet roofs of Ile de la Cité, lifted itself over the distant chimneys like a prisoner rising from a cot, and slipped reluctantly into the courtyard of the prefecture. Inspector Moreau walked through the gate with Elise beside him, his coat damp at the collar, his pipe unlit in his pocket. The doors of the building stood open as though they had never been shut in the first place. The rain-washed stones of the entryway held their shine with pride. Inside, the prefecture moved with a quiet urgency. Clerks carried files from room to room. Policemen strode to and from the telegraph office on errands, framed as routine but vibrating with something less comfortable. Curiosity disguised as duty. The walls seemed to hold their breath as Moreau and Elise walked past, but nothing was said aloud. Her presence turned whispers into noise. In their silence, the clerks had said enough. Janvier waited near Moreau's office, as if guarding its door from an unspoken trespass. "He's in there," Janvier said. He nodded at the frosted glass panel, where the brass letters of Inspecteur Moreau now cast two shadows. Moreau paused. "The prefect?" "No," Janvier said, voice low. "The other one? Lyonnet's ghost, or its current address?" It was true. The moment Moreau stepped inside, he recognized something had changed. The chair at the desk was occupied, leaning back with a posture that did not belong to any officer. The man from under the bridge, still unnamed, still wearing that plain expression which refused to reveal whether it had been carved or worn smooth by habit, looked up and smiled. "A welcoming office," he said, glancing around. "Void of trophies. I admire that in a hunter." Moreau didn't return the smile. "You found your way up?" "Doors open for those already inside," the man said softly. "I've always preferred to walk through things rather than into them." Elise stood a few steps back near the door, lips pressed into something that wasn't quite defiance, but close. Moreau crossed to his desk, giving the man nothing more than a glance. He placed the stack of letters down, opened the top drawer, and very deliberately removed his notebook. "You came here for the prefecture," Moreau said, "not me." "It was never about you," the man admitted. "You were simply the one who would understand what can't be written in reports and can't be erased by orders." He leaned forward. "The ministry wants a name, a culprit. They have decided it will be you." Janvier stiffened, his hand darting to the sidearm at his belt, but Moreau raised a hand in silence. "Me? Who better?" the man said. "Inspector Moreau, veteran investigator, haunted by disappearances in riverfront villages, trusted with matters requiring discretion. A clean record, impeccable judgment. The public will gasp, the prefect will sigh, the file will close." The man ran a hand idly across the blotter as he spoke. One more drawer filled. "And Elise?" Moreau asked. The man turned to her and gave a half bow. "She disappears, shifts towns. Her new name is not mine to choose." He paused. "But if you accept what they need, she walks free. You understand how paper works, Inspector. Ink is lighter than blood." Silence settled like a third presence in the room. The clock on the wall ticked its precise contempt. Somewhere in the building, typewriters half-heartedly attempted objectivity. Elise looked at Moreau, her breath held like a confession still unspoken. Moreau sat. He took out his pipe and turned it over, losing himself in the grain of the wood. Then he set it aside and pulled open the central drawer, the one where he kept very few personal items. Among them, a postal seal, a police press stamp, and a piece of string. He laid the string on the blotter. "Clement Aubry tied his letter with string," Moreau said quietly, "because he believed it would reach someone before the truth did. But he didn't send it in time." He slid the matchbox, vulgar blue, anchor printed in gilt, onto the desk. "You left this, at the scene, deliberately." He looked up. "To make sure I followed you here. You wanted me to choose between silence and guilt." "You did follow," the man replied. "You've proven your merit. All I require is the final gesture." He leaned back, folding his hands. "Say it." "I did it. You will not lack for comfort." "And what will I lack?" Moreau asked, almost pleasantly. "The rest of your breath," the man said. Something inside Elise broke, not visibly, not audibly, but in the subtle absence of the surviving kind of hope. But she did not cry or plead. She stepped forward, lifting her chin just enough to change the angle of her gaze. "He won't say it." The man shrugged. "Then I will take his silence as ownership. Courts are not picky. They like things that do not speak back." Janvier moved closer, blocking the door, his jaw tight. "Inspector?" Moreau stood. He moved slowly, as if rearranging the shape of the air. "Elise," he said, "would you please hand me my coat?" She did, the grey one, still damp from the river. He dug into the pocket and pulled out the burned scrap from Aubry's hearth, its ghost text barely legible. "Not to Paris. I will send—" He placed it beside the ledger photograph, the river coin from the boy at the quay, and the two letters, one original, one copy. "These," Moreau said, "are not evidence. They are a conversation. One I could choose to finish, but I won't." The man's face, for the first time, altered. Slightly. A tiny hinge inside his expression loosened, like doubt being given permission. "Then you understand nothing," the man said. "I offered you a place among the living. You would rather join the drowned." "I live differently," Moreau said, "and I file differently." He opened the bottom drawer of his desk, an empty cavern of polished wood, and placed the letters inside. He closed it with a soft finality. "Janvier," he said, still looking at the man, "what's the prefecture's most embarrassing habit?" Janvier caught up at once. "Paperwork, sir?" "Correct." Moreau turned to the man. "If you kill me, another inspector rises, another file opens. If you take Elise, I will spend what remains of myself tracking you or whatever face you choose next. If you leave us, the prefecture will drown in what it doesn't understand, rumors, blotted names, resignations. And you'll become exactly what you claim to have outgrown, a ghost defined by the river." The man stared at him a long time. Then, for the first and only time, he seemed to exhale with something like fatigue. "You are not what I wanted," he said. "No," Moreau replied. "That's why I'm still breathing." The man tapped twice on the desk as though sealing an unspoken treaty, and rose. He adjusted his hat. "To borrow a phrase," he said, eyes on Elise, "do not answer when the river calls." And he left. Not hurried, not watched, just gone, like fog learning to travel upward. In the heavy stillness that followed, Moreau loosely sorted the letters one last time. Then he lit his pipe, allowing the smoke to find its own shape. Janvier broke the silence first. "Sir?" "Find out everything you can about Victor Lyonnais," Moreau said, "but quietly. Let the ministry chase ghosts." He looked at Elise. She was watching the window, not to flee, but to witness the city try once more to make sense of its daylight. "You're free," he said gently. She nodded. "And you?" "I have reports to file," he said. "And some I won't." Janvier grinned for the first time that day. The clock ticked on. Files breathed in their cabinets. The city resumed its lie of movement and order. Elise turned to Moreau. "Will you ever know his name?" Moreau answered the only way a man like him could. "I already do, I just won't write it." Outside, the bells. Notre Dame finally spoke the hour. It was later than expected, but the day was still possible.